Good afternoon, dear students. A warm welcome from Crete to the 9th lecture of the online training course on innovation and entrepreneurship. I'm very happy to welcome you again on our weekly meeting. This online training course is organized by EURECA-PRO and the Technical University of Crete with the valuable contribution of all the institutions participating in the EURECA-PRO Alliance and consists of 14 lectures. Please don't forget to keep your microphone muted during the lecture. After the session, time will be dedicated to answer all of your questions and hopefully we could initiate a fruitful discussion. Please feel free to use the raise hand button after the end of the talk and pose your question live, or if you don't feel comfortable with that, post your question in the chat. Last week, Professor Schock from the Technical University Bergakademie Freiberg gave us an inspiring talk on entrepreneurship and sustainability reporting. This week, I am honored to introduce to you Ms Ana Patricia Fanjul Alemani, a research assistant at the IESE Business School and at the Center of Monetary and Financial Studies. Today's lecture is entitled Crafting Business Models and Lean Startups. Mrs. Fanjul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will share the screen then.
You can share your screen, yes.
Okay, can you see the presentation?
We can see it. Could you, okay, now is it in presentation mode. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending this session. The topic we're going to cover today, I think it's a very interesting one, which is about how to craft a business model and how to do it using the Lean Startup methodology. And you might wonder what exactly are Lean Startups. This is precisely the first topic we're going to be covering. We will do an introduction on what Lean Startups are, and then we will go in detail about how does this help craft business models. And finally, we will see whether this approach, whether Lean Startups work or not. We will review some of the literature and also the evidence and see whether this framework has improved or not the business models we see around. So first, to see what are Lean Startups, you probably have heard the term before, and you may have even attended a series of lectures on what Lean Startups are. Here we will do a brief account of what the term means. First, what you should know is that it is a very influential framework. You can see below an article from the Harvard Business Review that is titled, Why the Lean Startup Changes Everything. And why does it really change everything? Because it proposes a very novel framework to understand entrepreneurship and new business models. You can see on the right-hand side the creator of this model, Eric Ries, and what he wanted to design was a very scientific approach on how to create and manage startups. Why? Because he had seen that the usual approach we take would be this, for example, the traditional business model. First, you do your market research. Imagine, for example, if I am an entrepreneur that is trying to build a new product. For example, imagine I want to create a new app for people to park. And first, the first step I would do following this traditional model is to do my market research and to assess whether there is a need or not for this new product. Then I would develop a solid strategy that includes my marketing portfolio, the client I want to target, my finances, how much I expect to make each of the years I'm operative. And then with all this information, I would write a business plan. This plan I would use to pitch it to investors to gain finance for my project. Then I would assemble a winning team with the best people in each area, and I would deliver a great product. This is more or less the framework we would use if we were trying to develop a traditional model. What is the problem? That using this framework, does this work for startups or not? What we find is that using this framework we have been speaking about, the traditional framework, over 75% of startups fail. It really doesn't work for startups. And what Eric Ries discovered is that the main reason for this is that we have a problem when we are talking about startups. With the traditional formula, you assume that you are able to assess the needs of the market. But the problem with startups is that they often tackle a new market, a market we don't really know. And so all the estimates of the demand are based upon our best guesses on what people would need or would want. You don't really know what the market is many times when you are working with a startup. That is why this traditional method was failing for startups. A lot of companies were spending a lot of time developing a product and a lot of money that in the end didn't really have a real demand on the market. The photograph you can see on the right-hand side is from Parkmate. Parkmate is a startup that had a very novel idea. What they wanted to do is to create an app that would tell you which parking slots are available in real time. So if you want to park your car, for example, you would know within a city which parking slots are already available. You wouldn't have to go looking endlessly for a spot to park your car. You would know right away where there is a free space. And they thought this was a very good idea because they thought for consumers, they would have very easy parking. Instead of spending a lot of their time in their car trying to look for a spot, they would know straight away where to go. For the city, they thought it would also have a lot of value. They thought that the mayor of the city, for example, would be trying to encourage their company, since they would have much freer streets, less traffic. It seemed like a win-win for everyone. So they spent a lot of time doing market research, developing a perfect app that was really usable, very user-friendly, very attractive. And once they started to market it, they discovered that nobody really wanted it. Why? Because they had tackled a need, but they hadn't really thought about how to present it to the consumer, what the consumer really wanted and needed and demanded. And so they had to change their whole company. They are now restructuring it to try to tackle this demand. But they had already spent a whole lot of time and money and effort in something that didn't really work. So what does the Lean method propose? Instead of building the perfect product and then seeing whether does it work or not, you try to experiment along the way to adapt your product. You first build something that is not the perfect product. It's something that has the core capabilities of your product, so that you can test whether it has a real demand or not, and what customers really want from your product. Then you measure the real information from the market you are getting, and you learn and validate your hypotheses, or you reject them. And depending on what you find, you pivot or adapt your product to adapt to this real demand you are seeing in real time with actual numbers. And this really changes the framework. If you think about the two methods, this way you are really tackling a real demand. You have real data on whether your product is wanted or not and how is it wanted. So to design this test, what you do is to find 2 or 3 key assumptions that would really determine the success of your model. So in this case, it would be, for example, to know whether people want an app that tells them where to park, whether they are willing to download an app and submit their information to see in real time the parking slots, and whether the city is willing to support you. And then you find the cheapest and fastest way to test this hypothesis. You build a minimum viable product which has only the critical features of your product. So if you see the image on the right-hand side, you don't build step by step the perfect product. You build something that has the core capabilities and that can then be improved into your perfect product, but something that has the key features so that you know whether this is demanded in the market or not. You measure the information you get real data on your product, and then depending on whether these hypotheses are accepted or rejected, then you pivot or you persevere, you change your product, or if you find that it's working, you adapt it depending on the information you're getting. So this is the main idea of what the lean method is. We're going to see now how does it help a company craft a business model. So first, the first step for the lean methodology is focusing on what need are you serving, because you may have a great idea, but it might be that it's not a real need for your customers. So what need are you serving really, and for whom? And to assess this, we're going to see that a tool that is very handy is the customer journey map. Then the second step we will focus on is why. Why should people buy your product? What is your value proposition? What are you adding to your product that is really valuable for the customer? Then we will focus on these key hypotheses you need to experiment and to see whether your product would be successful or not in the market. And finally, we will see that all these different tools can be summarized in the business model canvas, which you probably are already familiar with. So the first step is to focus on the need you are covering in the market. Lean has a very customer-centric focus because they understand that you may have a great idea, but you really have to focus on whether that holds value and for whom. The photo you can see on the right-hand side, it's from a very novel startup named Kazoo. And what they thought is that the process of buying cars, for example, is something that is usually very time-consuming. And when you buy a second-hand car, you have many concerns because you don't know the quality of the car, whether it will be all right or not, whether someone is trying to cheat you. You find it very difficult to find them online because sometimes they are in different stores and you have to go them and check them out physically. So what they did was to create a platform where you could buy second-hand cars that had already been checked. So they do the whole checking and putting the car up to date process, and they ensure that they meet quality standards, and then they deliver it to you within a day. That way you have all the information you want on the car. You can see many different cars at the same time with a very small amount of effort. You have it very fast, and you are also sure that it meets your quality standards. So this is the company they created, and they created it precisely because they had seen this need. They had seen how people struggle when buying second-hand cars, and they thought that they could contribute to these types of customers. So the customers that are young, they are used to finding things in the internet, and they would be really up to buying their car on the internet if they knew that the quality standards would be met. So this would be the first step of Lean, to see with a consumer-centric approach, what need are you covering and for whom? Once you have that clear, it really is useful to build your customer journey map. And what is this? This is just a tool to help you see the different steps that the customer has along the journey they do when they purchase a product. Because you may think about yourself when you're buying a product and you have very different levels of engagement and also very different pains, they call them, along the way. Why? Because, for example, in the beginning, you might just be looking for information. So, for example, if I want to buy a second-hand car, I may just be scanning the internet to see whether I see a good option or not. And what this tool does is to identify in each of those steps, for example, the first one where I'm just looking for scanning for information on the internet, which are my pains, which means which are the things that worry me along the way. So, for example, at the beginning, I may be, for example, receiving a lot of information and I'm not able to process it. Then on the second step, I would already be considering the options. Then the step where I actually buy the product, the service I received, and then the post-service. So, oops, sorry. Sorry about that. I pushed the wrong key. So, for example, if I want to buy a dress online, first I would be on the search stage. And what are my pains? That I have, for example, a limited budget, I may not be able to find my size. And finally, I refine my search and I find the dress I want. And along the way, I may have found that there are not many stores that offer this type of dress, that I don't find many options that are according to my taste. And then finally, for example, I may buy something and I have to wait for the store to respond to me. Then once they respond, if I like the price, I finally buy. And you can see that along the way, there are many negative experiences that I have to face. What does the Lean method propose? Focus on those negative experiences and try to bring value in all of them. So for example, regarding the example we were talking about the used cars, the pains during the search stage would be that I have a limited budget. I'm not able to contrast a lot of information on the internet because many cars are not listed. I also have quality concerns, and that is precisely what they are trying to address. Then they have a very easy framework where you can order the cars, which would be already on the discovery step. And regarding the purchase, they are very fast. They have very fast delivery. They send it to you the next day after you buy it. And they have a very good customer sales and process, and also a service afterwards, so that if you have any problem, you can reach them. They have been able to tackle all these pains, all these negative experiences the customer is facing. And so they bring value to the customer precisely by offering something that meets those needs. So this would be the first step, to know what are you building and for whom. And then the second step would be to determine what do you bring that is unique for the customer. Why would someone choose you? This is called the value proposition. And in here, one of the authors that has been very influential is Simon Sinek. He has a very nice talk, a very nice TED talk that is called Start With Why. And he argues that people buy why you do things. So for example, in the case of Apple, we don't really buy smartphones, tablets, smartwatches, just because they are provided, because we wouldn't buy them from different stores. We buy them because we associate them with the values of Apple. Apple has identified a very strong value proposition, and it's precisely that which they are bringing to the customers. And to identify this, you can use the value proposition canvas. The idea is to focus on these pains we were talking about, the tasks the customer has to do, and the gains from your product. And then to see which pain relievers you are bringing, how are you addressing those pains, which products and services, and which gains for the customer, and to focus on what value added do you bring to the table. Why would someone choose your product instead of someone else's? Okay, so this would be the second step, to see the value you bring to the table. And then we enter the core of the Lean method, which is to hypothesis and experiment based on those hypotheses you had made. So to hypothesis, we follow also a series of steps. First, we build a hypothesis that will be just these key things that would need to be validated for my project to work. Then we build this minimum viable product. This product we were saying that is just the least we can do that has the core capabilities of our product for us to see whether it does really have a demand on the market. Then we define the KPIs, which are the things I want to measure. And we will see that in this regard, it's often very useful to have a very good landing page. We validate or reject our hypothesis, and then we know if we have to continue on the path we were on or pivot towards a new path. So regarding the first step, building a hypothesis, this would be just the key information you need to see whether your project will work. And one really good example here is Zappos. Zappos, which you can see on the right-hand side, was a company that was created as a startup, is now very successful. And their idea was to build the first online store of shoes. When it was created, there weren't all that many opportunities available online to buy shoes, and the options in the stores were also very limited. So the founder thought that if he could build a web page where he could sell the shoes, it would be very beneficial for everyone. And the key hypothesis he needed to know was whether people would be willing to buy shoes online, whether there really was a demand or not for that first online site of shoes. And what he did was to go to different stores and take photographs of the shoes they had. And he built a site as if he was really selling all those shoes, and he uploaded the photographs from the stores. Why? Because he then, if someone ordered a shoe, would go to the store, buy those shoes, and ship it to them. And he was losing money with each of the purchases that were made on the site. But this way he was able to know whether people were really willing or not to invest in this type of activity, whether there was a real demand for shoes online. And what he found was that there really was a demand for shoes online, and his store was very successful. But if you see the way he tested it, he focused on that main hypothesis that was needed for his project to work. And then he tested it. And as you can see, it was way cheaper than if he had built his whole store, bought all the inventory, the shoes, prepared everything, and then waited for the demand to come. This is why it's really important within the Lean methodology to determine which are the key hypotheses you need to validate, which in the case of Zappos, for example, was whether people are willing to buy shoes online or not. And to build this hypothesis, this key hypothesis, you have to focus on two things. First, whether your proposal is attractive, whether people desire the thing you're selling, whether does it solve a real need. And then whether is it feasible, whether are you able to build this product and run this model with the resources and skills you have. So for example, in the case of Nespresso, which we will see later on in greater detail, you know that the company was first launched for offices only. And it didn't really succeed because they thought that the companies would be able to pay to have faster coffee making. And in reality, it was not true. That hypothesis was not validated. What they did then was to focus on two markets, the companies and also houses. And they sold using two different methods. The pods, the Nespresso pods, they would sell only on their own stores. And the machines, they would share among different retailers. And with this method, we will see it later on, but they were able to provide an option that was really feasible. It is a really successful business model, in part because they decided to deliver these two products differently. That was their key hypothesis. They had two key hypotheses. First, that people would be willing to take Nespresso coffee. And second, that whether this model would be a viable option or not. And so to summarize this hypothesis, we have to test, we have to see whether it creates value for the company and for the customers. And you can see here that we have already been speaking about this value proposition, about what value, the center part of the chart, what value do we bring to the customers? So for example, in the case of Nespresso, we have seen that it has both the machines and the Nespresso pods, and that they have very different value propositions because they both share this idea of quality, of variety, of ease, but they are also very different. How are they different? For example, the Nespresso machines, which you can see on yellow, they are made by some manufacturers that are associated with a company, and if you focus on the channels part here, they are shipped through different retailers. You can go through Carrefour, for example, and you would find these Nespresso machines. Their main target they are facing here is households, and they get revenue from the sale of these machines, which they have to share with the retailers. And then the pods have a very different channel. They can be either ordered by mail at the site of Nespresso or at those Nespresso stores that they build. And they get very high revenues from this, which they do not have to share with any of the retailers because they have their own channel to distribute these pods. Once they have a customer that they have fidelized because he has already bought their machine, they are able to deliver in a way that is very profitable for them. It also allows them to do direct business to consumer distribution, as you can see on the left-hand side. This means that they have direct information on each of the customers and what they are buying and with which time frameworks they are buying it. They have a lot of direct information on their customers. They have also the key resources for these Nespresso pods is these distribution channels. This is the key hypothesis that they were able to validate. And you can see that the cost structure is also very different. Instead of having to deliver to all these different retailers, they deliver it directly to customers. So costs are really much lower. Okay, so we have seen this hypothesis we would need to validate, and we will now turn into the minimum viable product. And this, as we had said, is to build the key capabilities of your product to collect the maximum information you can with the least effort and the least money needed. It is not the perfect product you need. It is just the product with the key capabilities you need for it to work. And you will probably know Airbnb. When they first started this idea, they tested it with their own home. They rented some of the rooms online as if they were people that were using their platform. And they found that there was a real demand for it. And so they started the whole page marketing campaign. But first they had just used this very small minimal viable product, the product that had just the key capabilities to see whether there was a demand on the market or not. And one product that was also very successful with its minimum viable product was Uber. Uber at first was constructed using SMS. You had to write to the center and then they would answer you with which rides were available. In this way, they tested whether people would be comfortable using their phones to reach a cab. And they found that indeed they were. This was their minimum viable product. It was not the platform, the perfect platform we see now that is very user-friendly and it's very nice, but it was just enough to see whether they would have demand for the product or not. And why would we use this minimum viable product? Well, first, because we are able to give like a sneak peek on whether this satisfies a real need from the market. We are also able to predict demand because we were saying that within a market, for startups, many times we don't know what the market is. And we make forecasts that are only based on our assumptions. This way we are able to see in real time the demand curves we're generating. It also allows us to identify risks at an early stage. Because, for example, I can see that the main concern of many people using Uber is security and to ensure that I have a very strong service there. I'm able also to analyze user preferences. If I have a variety of products, then I can see which ones work best. And I can optimize my product and see how to monetize it, which is, as we were seeing with the Nespresso pods, it can be something that is core to my model and that would not be profitable otherwise. But if I test the way I want to make it profitable and it is working, the model I'm having, then I can see in real time whether that is feasible or not. And there are some authors that distinguish between the minimum viable product, which is the product that has the key capabilities for my strategy to work, and the minimum lovable product, which would be the next step. Once I have seen whether there is demand for my product or not, I focus on the whole user experience. I build someone that people really would love, that people would engage on emotionally, and that is very different from competitors. That would be the second step. Once I have been able to assess whether there is a real demand or not for my product, then I will see how do I make it attractable for customers and which things could help drive my demand. Once I have seen that this focuses on a real need from the market. Okay, so we have seen the importance of building a strong hypothesis, this minimum viable product and minimum lovable product. And then I will see which KPIs, which measurements I'm going to track. So imagine I'm testing my startup. I would need to know how to measure whether it is working or not, whether my strategy is working or not. So for example, imagine I want to offer online calligraphy, for example. I could test, for example, whether my product attracts attention, and then I would focus on metrics like whether the number of clicks or the number of traffic my site is generating. I could also focus on the engagement KPIs to see which clients really tried my product, or the value KPIs, which clients were willing to pay for my product. And also the retention KPIs. Here there is a very strong metric, that is the churn rate, which is the percentage of clients that didn't really, in the end, weren't interested in your product, or whether they were. So this is what focuses on whether you were able to return or not these customers. So you have to focus on the key KPIs that would be needed to validate your hypothesis. Depending on your key hypothesis, the KPIs you need will also be different. And one thing that really helps when tracking these KPIs is to create a landing page. And what we mean by this phrase is a page that would serve as an introduction for your product. And if you think about it, this is a very cheap resource because many of us can build on WordPress, for example, a site where we can see whether this is or not a viable idea, whether people would be interested. For example, I can measure whether people would click on the different spaces I have. And the main ingredients these landing pages have are often a very eye-catching headline, and then they have many different elements, but I wanted to focus on the action button, which you can see numbered as 3. That is what really would drive action within my page. You can see here some examples. So you can see here the title we were talking about, and then we have below this button that really calls you to action. And you can use as KPIs both the people that enter this site and the people that would be really interested on the product, that are really sending you the information for you to contact them. And this action button has many different shapes and sizes, but the main message is always the same. You can see in this different example of a landing page, the button is become a driver. You have to identify your value proposition and to really summarize it within this landing page to see whether people would be willing and able or not to purchase your product. So this will be step number 3, to build your KPIs and the landing page to see how are you going to measure whether your hypothesis worked or not. The next step then would be to validate this hypothesis. And here there is a very strong concept that was very novel within the Lean Startup framework, which is pivoting. And as you may know, Spotify started as a podcast service. They first thought that they could provide a very cheap and easy service of podcasting. And what they found was that people weren't really interested at that point in time in a podcasting service, but they were really interested on a streaming music service. And so they pivoted, which means that they changed their idea to adapt to the needs they were seeing in the market. They pivoted or adapted into this new idea, which is, as we know nowadays, Spotify. The platform, the actual platform, was born here. They decided to shift from the idea of online podcasting to online music subscriptions. And this is something that is often very hard for entrepreneurs because they have an idea they have really nourished and that they are very proud of. And people oftentimes have trouble trying to adapt that to the market. But it's very important because they have to focus on a real need. There are some things that may be very good ideas, but in the end, if the market does not want what you're offering, you are not helping anybody. This is why this concept is very important. And there are many different types of pivots. You could have a zooming pivot, for example, where you find that one capability, like in this case, for example, the streaming music, drives a lot of interest, and you shift your product to respond to that need you are identifying. And you could also have the reverse situation where you have a zoom out pivot. You broaden the scope of the product you were offering. Imagine, for example, if I was offering used cars and I find that there is a very high demand, for example, also for used motorbikes, then I can zoom out and consider implementing both of them within my service. I could also change my customer segment. Imagine that you were initially trying to offer a service and you find that the people you were targeting are not really interested in the service, but someone else is. So you can pivot, you can change the focus of your company and address this new sector. There is also a customer need pivot. And this is a very hard one, because if you find that the problem is not really, the problem you were tackling is not really important to your customers, then you need to find a new value proposition, something that really serves a need for your customers. You could also have, for example, a platform pivot. Imagine you find that people are not willing to use an app, but would rather use a web page to hire a service. Then you can change the way you were structuring your service and adapt. There are many different types. You could also do a different business architecture pivot. As you know, companies often focus either on high margins with low volumes, or in low volumes, on high volumes but with low margins. You could change the space you are occupying on the market if you found that the demand for your product, for example, would better suit a very selective type of customer. Then you can change and sell less units at a higher price and target a niche that is more higher class, for example. You could also do a value capture pivot, and you could change how are you monetizing your product. So in the example we were talking about Nespresso, for example, and Nespresso changed the way they were monetizing their pods, and they discovered a very successful and very hard to replicate system where they are able to deliver directly to their customers the pods. You could also have an engine growth pivot, which means that, for example, there are different types of business models. The viral business model, for example, where you trust that your product will turn viral and then everybody wants to buy it based on recommendations. You could change that, for example, if you see that this is not the case, that people are not recommending your product, that it would be better, for example, to focus on paid growth, which is something that we use to design when you invest in marketing to make customers aware that your product is out there. You could also have a channel pivot, which is to change the way you sell your product or service, and a technology pivot. Imagine that a technology comes out when you are testing your product that makes something you do more effective. Then you can use it within your product and change the way you were delivering the product so that it is more efficient, for example. Okay, so we have seen what are lean startups. We have done an overview on how to craft the business model. This is a very deep topic. I, for example, attended once an 90-hour training course on this topic. We have just been able to cover like an introduction to the topic, but I will leave at the end some recommended materials in case you want to go deeper. And finally, I also wanted to do a check on whether all this we have been seeing, does it work or not? Is this a good model? Is lean a good model to use? Or should we focus on something different? Because the first developments of this model were brought on 2011. So what have we learned up until now? Do we know whether this is a good strategy for businesses, or should we focus on a different strategy? And we have some good news, that is that lean indeed does work. There is evidence showing that lean startups perform way better than their competitors, precisely because they are able to assess in real time whether there is demand or not for the products they are making. And they are able to change and adapt in a way that is way cheaper and faster than their competitors. But there are also some drawbacks. What the research has found is that lean does work, but it's not perfect. There are some aspects of lean that may even be harmful. For example, sometimes customers don't really know what they want. So if you ask them, would you want something like, for example, the first people that were using Zoom, would you be willing to meet through a screen with the people you love or you want to do business meetings with? Sometimes change is very disruptive. And so people at first might have thought that they wouldn't have a demand for this service, and then later on they may find that they would really enjoy it. So this is a drawback of Lean. Why? Because if people do not know already what they would want, then you might test it and you might get the impression that this would not be a viable idea, when in reality it might be. There are also no clear steps on how to achieve this business canvas we were talking about. Different authors propose different strategies, but there is still a lot of research to see whether there is an optimal path, whether that depends on the business model, on which things should one model focus rather than another. There is still a lot to work on there. And also there is a lack of new strategies to decide on which experiments I want to implement. Because imagine if I'm not able to determine which are my key hypotheses, then I will do experiments, but I may not gain the real information I was hoping for. So overall, we find that Lean is a useful framework, but it's also one that continues improving. It is a very useful framework to craft your business model, but it also has some drawbacks. And you have to be aware of those drawbacks. And there is also room for the Lean method to continue improving on showing us how to better craft our business models. So to conclude, Lean is based upon this scientific approach we have been discussing, upon this approach where I want to design a minimum viable product and then experiment to see whether there is a real demand or not for the product I am serving, and whether it would really serve a need for my customers or not. And as we have seen, we have to focus here on what need are we serving, for whom, why would they buy you, what value proposition are you offering that is different from the rest of the companies that are already in the market, and then testing through continuous experimentation in a very cheap way and fast, just the key hypothesis of my model, would they work or not? And to adapt continuously to what the market is telling you. So if you find that the need you had identified is not really important for your customers, then focus on a need that really is. You have to be able to bring real value to the table. And as we have seen, when you want to craft your business model, Lean is a very effective method, but it has also got some weaknesses, which you have to be aware about if you are using it to design and craft your business model. And finally, I wanted to leave you here on the presentation some further material that you can check on to see if you are interested on the topic, then you can check it to see some further information and some studies on Lean, and also some real-life applications the method has had. So thank you very much, and I am at your disposal for any question you may have.
Thank you, Mrs. Fanjul. Mrs. Fanjul has already prepared for you a poll. I believe we could start the poll now.
Yeah,
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
We could start the poll now, and afterwards we can go further with the questions.
With the questions, perfect. Thank you.
You will have 5 minutes. 5 minutes is okay. 2 minutes. Okay, let's start with 2 minutes. Okay, thank you very much for your participation. Now we could share the results of the poll.
Yeah, I can share my screen if you want.
I think that the students can see the result.
Okay.
Now.
So this is very nice because I see that there are a lot of people that have already thought about becoming an entrepreneur, and also a lot of people that have identified an idea. And I think that you can really use this method, the lean method, to assess whether this idea really brings what value to your customer or not. And if you have any questions, then feel free to ask about it.
So, I see Marita raised her hand.
Yeah, go ahead.
All these examples that you showed us involved either a service or a product addressed to customers. And my question is, will lean approach work for deep tech company startups? And by deep tech, I mean potential startups that emerge from our research laboratories. And they may have, let's say, a smaller customer
Okay.
You know what I mean.
Yeah.
They are addressed to less customers. I mean, I have in mind, let's say, a medical device. Okay. Thank you. And thank you for the lecture. It was a really nice one.
Thank you. Thank you for your question also, because it's a very interesting one. And I think that lean does have some limitations, and some of them are that you really testing for types of products that don't really have a market yet, it's very hard. So you would have to identify, to try, I guess, because if from what I understand from your question, you don't really know to whom this drug, for example, would sell, right?
I guess that, let's say, if I have a camera, I can build a camera with a super spectral analysis that does not exist. I target, my customers are research labs or hospitals, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
I think that the framework could be used because you could, for example, approach these hospitals and test whether they would be interested in a site that offers these devices. But it's also true that one of the limitations of lean is that when you have something that is very disruptive, something that really changes the market, sometimes the customers are not really able to see the potential of your product. So maybe they would buy it if they saw it on a store, for example, or if the product was already very mature. But sometimes when something is very groundbreaking, it's difficult to test it with lean. I think you could definitely use the method, but just be aware that if you get a rejection of this product, it might be that people are not yet able to see the potential of the product. It does not mean right away that a product is a bad one.
With lean,
Yes.
when do I go to the investors after I do the hypothesis and experimentation?
Yeah, when you have real data on the market, then you are able to provide a very a more complete, something that is real for the investors, because otherwise you are just projecting on the demand based on what you think, for example, this new camera would attract. So you are just forecasting, but you don't really know the market. And lean gives you this real information on the market, and you can present that to investors and provide some figures that are real, that are based on the market data.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I don't see other questions either on chat or any raised hands. So I can pose my question as well, because I was just thinking, what does lean stands for? Is it an abbreviation or?
Yeah, lean, it's like when you say someone is lean, it's like he's very fit. For example, he doesn't really have a lot of fat. It's the same with this model. You can see that it really has just the fiber, just like the key things for it to work. You don't have any of the, for example, red tape or all those expensive things that would slow down how you check your product. It really has just the core capabilities.
Okay, now I understand the concept.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So, dear students, I hope this was an interesting topic for you, and since you don't have any more questions, I will thank again Mrs. Fanjul for this very interesting and concise lecture.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. And before closing this session, please let me remind you our next appointment, which will be on Wednesday, the 8th of June at 1 in the afternoon, Central European Summer Time. And the name of our next lecturer is Professor Slavomir Olko, an associate professor at the Silesian University of Technology in the Faculty of Organization and Management. Professor Olko will give us an insight on the role of innovation in developing new ventures. We are looking forward to learn more on that subject on the 8th of June. Thank you for your participation and have a nice rest of the day. Mrs. Fanjul, could you please stay